All right, hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. Currently, we are in Acts chapter 18, and as we move forward with Paul, missionary journeys or apostolic journeys, I think that's more correct, apostolic. Um, Even though missionary journeys, missionaries and apostolics. We could be splitting hairs on definition, and certainly when it comes to what it is both do, but excuse me, but apostolic would probably be more correct. And the reason why I say that is because anyone can be a missionary. Anyone, not everyone can be, or everyone is called to be an apostle. All right, that said, um, as we see, Paul in his journeys, however, has much persecution. And as we're going to see here, that the Jews literally followed Paul everywhere he went. If they found out Paul was in a certain, city, they followed him there and literally persecuted him. Another thing, too, as we get into Acts chapter 18, is just a kind of a sidebar note that I know it may not be as interesting to other people, but what we're going to also see is one of the ways in which scholars date the Bible or date certain events in the Bible. And if you ever have a study Bible and you look at either the introductions or the notes, and you will see that date written. Okay, so they approximate a date, and one of the ways they do that, and so now you can arrive at the date. And it's also going to also give us a dating of where we are time-wise in the book of Acts. And if you remember, if you start with the book of Acts around AD 33, so from AD 33, now we can see some of the timelines of the Apostle Paul's travels. And remember how we said that certain events, we're at the 10-year mark. For example, Acts 10 with Cornelius was around the 10-year mark, of the church. And then Acts 15, it's a little further on. So let's get to it. And again, these things, I'll leave most of the details for the scholars, for which I'm not a scholar. So, as I said, I'll leave the details for them. All right, Acts chapter 18, verse 1 says, "After this, he left Athens and went to Corinth." Now, of course, Corinth, we're very familiar with Corinth in the New Testament here, for example, and then as well as Paul's two letters to the church. Now, the city of Corinth was, as with a lot of Roman cities, like Athens, what he just left. Remember, they were great cultural centers, philosophical centers. They boasted on wisdom and things like that, while at the same time, incredibly pagan. You remember in Athens, Paul saw all these statues devoted to some kind of pagan deity. And then he was even most taken by, there was a statue to an unknown God. It was just marked unknown God, to the unknown God. And so Paul used that statue to say, now this is the statue you should be worshiping, okay, instead of these other pagan deities. Corinth, as we will later see in the letters, Corinth was also a very immoral city. So when we think about cities today that are immoral, and I say in our nation, just for example, there are certain cities like Las Vegas. In fact, remember, Las Vegas is called Sin City. San Francisco, okay, I don't know if San Francisco is so much as a sin city as much as it is, they have a high homosexual population, and that's what some people target. But Corinth, there was a phrase that even I think the Roman Jews, that if they said you were Corinthicized or something like that because of the immorality. And that's why when you get to the letters of Corinth, you see the word sanctification, sanctify, used a lot. And the emphasis is that you need to separate yourself from this immoral city. They were incredibly immoral. There was all kinds of sexual impurity going on, fornication, a lot of stuff, that, okay, was just common to them. But it was also a city of means. So it was a middle class to upper middle class city. And that's something else that you'll find in Paul's letters that, hold on, this thing here. Hold on, this, how do I turn this off here? Okay. All right. No, my Siri was coming on. All right. So, let me go back here then. No. There we go. All right. So, where was I at? All right. So, anyway, the Corinthians were a very wealthy city. This was something that played out in Paul's writings. For example, one of the reasons why he didn't take, let's say, a salary from them or an honorarium from them, because they were hung up on money, and then they actually got mad at Paul because they was like, wait a minute, you don't take our offering? And so you'll find that in 2 Corinthians, actually 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, why he just said, he took money from other of his ministries, churches, in order for that. And the Corinthians got highly offended because, like, what's up with that, Paul? Anyway, so that after this, he left Athens and went to Corinth, where he found a Jewish man named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Now, this is what I was saying earlier about this event that Claudius, the emperor, who ordered the Jews out. Now, take note, a lot back during this time, especially, even though we still see it today, there's a lot of animosity against the Jews, which I don't know why today. I don't know why today. There's a lot. There are people that for some reason they don't like the Jews. I just don't understand why. Now, here, I think a lot of times they didn't like the Jews because the Jews had a habit of being irritating to people. It wasn't just being persecuted because they were, you can say, the chosen people. But anyway, Claudius ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Okay, now Priscilla and Aquila, or Aquila and Priscilla, is a very dynamic ministry team, husband and wife ministry team. And the reason why I say that is because, remember, as we're on the Gentile side of this, you see a lot more presence of women in leadership roles, as opposed to when you go through the Gospels. Remember, for example, when the counting of the feeding of the 5,000. Remember that was only counting men; they didn't count the women. Now, if that event had happened, let's say on the Gentile side here, we probably would have had a greater number because they would have counted the women and the children. So women, even though women still were beneath men, but a lot of times they would wield their power behind the scenes. Okay. Now, in this case, Aquila and Priscilla were devout believers in the Lord. And they would hook up with Paul and they would become very close friends. We're also going to see that Aquila and Priscilla were people of means, and they would also have a church in their house. They would also mentor people, as we will see later, for example, Apollos. So, and then what's also interesting is, as we will see later, is that Priscilla would be more of the one who spoke the most, more so than Aquila. Okay, we'll see that later. But in both cases, they were very strong believers. Okay, very strong believers. Now, it is interesting because when you see the issue of were women's role in the church, so your more conservative churches that basically says, women should not teach, speak in the church, obey their husbands at home. There are a lot of churches like that today. And yet, to me, if you read scripture, you'll see that's just, we're going to see Priscilla had a very strong presence in Paul's ministry, Paul's circles. Okay. So, and I say this, when it comes to the issue, does God call women to preach? Now, as with all subjects, there's the abuse, there's the ridiculous. And then you can go back and you can say, if God's hand, and this is always the true mark, if God has called someone, then God's grace will be upon that person. And to that, why fight against that? So if God has called a woman to pastor, and I know the verses, we'll get to them later, I know the verses where people will stand on to say that God does not call a woman to pastor. But here's the challenge. God, the scripture never says no matter what. In other words, absolutely no case. But like I say, that's a discussion for another another lesson. Okay. But the point that Priscilla has such an influence, such a strong presence, as Aquila and Priscilla. Okay. God's grace was upon her. And that's what I'm saying. That's what you can look at. All right. So, verse 2, where he found a Jewish man named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius. Now, let me go back to something too. Notice too, you see the Jewish people and later in Scripture, this is called the dispersed, like how Peter refers to as dispersed. James would say the 12 tribes dispersed, okay, spread abroad. And this happened from this writing about 500 years previous with the Babylonian exile. In other words, when God said he's getting ready to destroy, he was going to destroy Jerusalem because of the sins of Israel, and they never repented. God wiped out the land 80 years before, the northern kingdoms, and then with Babylon, he destroyed Jerusalem, he destroyed the temple, and then he deported the Jews to Babylon. Now, since that time, and you hear God using this language, he has spreaded the Jews into all of these different nations. He spreaded them. The prophecies that God is going to bring them back, go to these foreign lands and fish for his people, bring them back. And you have to also note that after 70 years after Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the land, you read this in Ezra and Nehemiah, only a remnant came back to Jerusalem. They rebuilt the wall and they restored the temple. I think they restored the temple, or started restoring the temple and the city of Jerusalem. But it was only a fraction of the people that had been expelled. So even up to the Jesus day, and now even through the book of Acts, most of the Jews were still dispersed into all the nations. This is one of the reasons you see in Acts chapter 2, when it says that the people that came from all around, okay, the people that came around, let me go back, kind of be interesting to take a quick look at this. Okay, went too far. All right, so this is Acts chapter 2, you remember, when they spoke in tongues and they spilled out into the streets speaking in tongues. And then verse 7 says, and they were astonished and amazed, saying, look, on all these who are speaking Galileans? How is it that each one of us can hear in our own native language? And that is very interesting because these are Jews. So these are not Gentiles. These are Jews right here. Notice he said native language. Why? Because many of them had been in these regions for over 500 years at this time due to the Babylonian exile. They'd settled in. They settled. In fact, Jeremiah even tells them that. Settle into the nation that I'm spreading you to, right? He said, settle in, build homes. You're going to be there for a while, okay? But listen what he says. How is it that each of us can hear in our own native language, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, those who live in Mesopotamia, in Judah, Cappadocia. This is Pontus, right? So remember that we just read Pontus. This is where Aquila is from. And then Asia, and then this Asia gave Paul a lot of grief. Phrygia, Pamphylia, notice Egypt and parts of Libya, near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. We all hear them speak the beneficent acts of God. Now, why is he saying this? These are different Jews that were dispersed. They kind of dispersed over the centuries. They settled into these different parts of the, at this point now, Roman Empire. Because what happened is that these dispersed was just simply passed on from Babylon to the Median Persian kingdoms to the Grecian kingdoms, and then now the Roman kingdoms, okay? And so this is why you see a lot of the Jews that lived in these different areas. And then what would happen is some of the Jews would still be faithful Jews, so they would maintain as best they could the Jewish culture. They would maintain um, um, the synagogues, which they would have the writings, okay, of the Old Testament. And if you were really, really a Jew of the Jews like Paul was, you wouldn't have what was called the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the original Hebrew scriptures. You know, people like Paul kind of frowned on that. You know, he's like, okay, well, if you got to have that, but you know, I read from the original manuscript, the original Hebrew of Hebrews. Okay, so you would have people who were like that. And so you would have the synagogues, you would have the Jewish, and they would observe the Jewish culture, the Sabbath day, they kept the Sabbath days, okay? And then sometimes this would be an irritant to the Romans. It was kind of an irritant. And so um, um, at some point you see now as Claudius, and this was a historical event. It happened, I think, somewhere around the neighborhood of AD. Let me see here. I just had it too. Just had it. I think this happened around 80. Come on. Was it 51? No, let's see. And the reason why I'm saying this, there is a reason why I am saying this. Somewhere they think around 8051 is when this happened. Around 8051, but I'm not a scholar, so I'm going to have to defer to that. Okay, I'll pick this up in the next study. Kind of interesting to me. I know it may not be as interesting to a lot of people, but if you're a history buff, and especially a Christian history buff, as I said, this is one of the reasons why how they, from a theological standpoint, Christian archaeology, how they kind of date stuff is very interesting. The date. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome. And I'll see you in the next study.